All right, everyone. Welcome to, what is this? Maybe I think the fifth session of this Majamaga study group. And today we're discussing chapters 6 and 7, an analysis of desire and the one who desires, and an analysis of the conditioned. So for this, because I think chapter 6 is relatively easier to understand and it's pretty short. So I think we can go through that a lot quicker and then go into chapter 7 for the bulk of our discussion because it's so much more long. And I think a lot of really interesting implications in that chapter. So yeah, I'll give a quick little summary about chapter 6 and what I got from it. And maybe then Sagar, you can add some comments and then we can have a little discussion on that before we move on to chapter 7. So in the very beginning, for Sudhir and Katsura's introduction of this chapter, they basically lay out that the interest of this chapter is basically to study the relationship between a state and the possessor of that state. And but we do this by analyzing the particular state of desire and the particular possessor of the state of desire, or the subject who's in desire. So that's cool. So this is another instance in which a very general approach, argumentative approach, is taken through an example of a particular phenomenon. And then, of course, Nāgārjuna towards the end will say that the analysis of this particular thing can be generalized to many things, if not all dharmas. Cool. So one of the things that Nāgārjuna sort of starts off with is this analysis of whether or not the desire and the desirer, do they arise successively and sequentially? You know, does the desire come before? Does the desire come before the desire, or does the desire come before the desire? But he also analyzes it in terms of co-occurrence, or simultaneous arising of desire and desirer. And basically, as we'll sort of go through the verses, we'll see that desire and desirer, or state and possessor of state, cannot ultimately exist either successively or simultaneously for a variety of reasons. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say for a really general talk. Sagar, do you have anything else to add generally before we sort of go into some of the verses?
Yeah, I generally want to just like ask the question of, I wonder, or just raise the question, I wonder what relationship this has to the arguments that we'll read later in chapter 18 about the self. Because the one who desires, it would generally be taken, say, by like a Nāyayika, who seem to generally be among his non-Buddhist interlocutors, the main ones, would be taken to be the self, right? Like Vatsyayana says, desires are qualities, and qualities inhere in a substance, so that substance in which they inhere is the self. That's one of the things that it's in his commentary to the Nyaya Sutra in the very first chapter. So like, this seems very intimately related to the question of the self, and I wonder if we could analyze like the state of desiring in a similar way to how the self is analyzed by Nāgārjuna later, which I guess we'll get to. And so I just wanted to raise that this actually is related to the way that he talks about motion, not the findability of the beginning of motion, but about the relationship between like the goer and the act of going, for which the point being is to like, or for which the point of that argument is to show that constitutive properties and the properties instantiated in an individual is not like already in the world. The difference between the two is arbitrary, or rather a reflection of our practical concerns, that we describe something as like a tree that is green rather than a green thing with treeness. Right? Like you could imagine a language that had this, and such people would say that there's no such thing as an individual object called a tree. There's certainly a predicate, treeness, but I've only seen green things. I've never seen a tree before. That's not a real individual. And so if we accept this kind of ontology, where when we speak of individuals having properties, we're just like ascribing a certain property and taking it to be constitutive and then saying that's the individual, then we could similarly apply the same thing to the self by just saying, by saying the fact that there is a quality like desire, like being desirous or something like that, doesn't mean that there has to be a substratum, a real substratum into which that inheres. We might at times say, yes, there is a substratum into which that is inhering, but that's just conventional talk, because at any point we could switch things around. So our ascription of qualities to a self doesn't commit us to having to believe or like give that ontological weight any more than like ascribing greenness to a tree, in the case I just described, requires us to commit us to the existence of an individual of the tree. And so, like, I wonder if the arguments in this chapter could be connected to this argument about like how we're just like selecting certain properties of what's really just this like nexus of properties and deciding that those are the self and then grouping the remainder of them around that self. And I wonder if this discussion of like a state and the possessor of that state might be related or could be connected to that, because it doesn't seem like the arguments are exactly the same, but it did seem like, because the arguments here are like about the co-occurrence of the state and the possessor of the state or whatever, but it seemed like it seemed to have a very close connection. So that was what I was thinking about.
Yeah, I thought a bit about that a little bit too. Even though I read this text a while ago, I can't remember quite the arguments on the chapter on the self. Though it also strikes me as a little different in the sense that the self might be something that may or may not possess certain kinds of states at any given time. Whereas here, it seems like we're talking about states that necessarily have a corresponding subject that cannot be isolated from it. So I feel like that's where I see the slight difference between that and like an analysis of the self. But I don't know, that's an interesting question you raise. How should we go about this? Should we just go by verse? I think we can go verse by verse for this chapter and then try to deal more argumentatively with the next chapter, because there's not a lot of verses in this one. So verse 1, if the one who desires existed prior to and without desire, then desire would be dependent on that. There being the one who desires, desire would then exist. But how will desire itself come to be if there is none who desires? Whether the desire exists or not, the analysis with respect to the one who desires will also go the same way.
There's a sentence that I don't understand in the explanation of 1. It is sentence number 3 of the explanation, but it is absurd to suppose that desire could be dependent on something that is itself free of desire, for their natures are contradictory. I don't understand why that is absurd.
Right. So let me see. Right. So this is an analysis of desire and desirer, or state and possessor, in which they arise successively. Right. So an analysis in which, in this case, desire existed prior to and without desire. Now, the claim here is that if desire existed prior to and without desire, then it kind of begs the question: what makes the desirer in that moment a desirer? If it's not, if it's before and without desire. So to say that something that, sorry.
So you could, like, the term "the one who desires," if you turn it into "desirer," I already understand it a bit better.
Right. The same thing applies in the reverse case as well. You can't have desire existing before and without a desirer.
Yeah.
So it doesn't make sense. And so that's one of the reasons why it doesn't make sense to say that this relationship happens sequentially or successively, because when it does, you're saying implicitly that the thing that comes before and the thing that comes after have no essential relationship between each other. But this kind of doesn't make sense in this particular case because desire and desirer, mutually entail each other on a definitional level. Desire is something that a desirer does, right? And a desirer is one who desires. So it doesn't make sense to say that they come successively.
So it's basically the same argument as the goer and the traversed path and stuff, right?
Yeah, I think it would be similar. Yeah, there's the goer and the going. There's no, you can't have one without the other. They're definitionally mutually entailing. And actually, that would bring me to a point that I wanted to make. Something that I I was confused a lot about in the past, and a sort of mistake I would kind of frequently make that I caught myself now with is that sometimes I was like thinking that if two things mutually imply each other on a definitional level, that means that they also mutually cause each other, which is definitely not the case, because this is a good example of how desire and desirer, even though they mutually entail each other on a definitional level on what it means to be a desirer or a desirer, they can't mutually cause each other at the same time either. Well, I guess now I'm skipping to the argument against co-occurrence, but yeah, I mean, I feel like that argument against their succession is pretty easy to understand now. I guess we can move to co-occurrence. So with verse 3, moreover, it cannot be that desire and the one who desires arise together. Desire and the one who desires would then be mutually independent. So that's also a very similar, but also like subtle argument. If two things that come together, for two things to come together, they should necessarily be distinct, even if they come together, because if they weren't distinct, there would be no coming together. But again, this repeats the same issue with the successive relation, which is that if they're mutually independent, if they're separate from each other, that makes no sense, because you can't have a desirer without a desirer. I mean, you can't have a desire without a desirer, and you can't have a desire without a desire. So in neither case, neither successively nor simultaneously does state and possessor or desire and desirer actually come to arise in this ultimate sense. So verse 4 says, if there is unity of state and subject, there is no co-occurrence. If there is not that with which the thing comes together. I read that with the wrong tone. If there is a unity of state and subject, there is no co-occurrence. There is not that with which the thing comes together. If there is distinctness, how indeed will there be co-occurrence? I actually had a bit of trouble interpreting that second part of the first sentence. There is not that with which the thing comes together. Is that basically just saying that when state and subject come together, there's nothing that actually brings them together? What do you guys think?
Well, I thought if there's unity, there's only like later on in the explanation, there's like with the X and the Y. And if they are really just one thing, I thought that explanation kind of applies to this part as well. Like if there's only actually X, then the thing with which it comes together, which is y, that it is not there because I is already in the x or something like that. Does that make sense?
Right, so let me read the, well, actually, let me go to the next verse and then read the explanation you're referring to. So verse 5, if there were co-occurrence in the case of unity, then that would be possible without one of the relata. If there were co-occurrence in the case of distinctness, then that too would be possible without one of the relata. All right, so at this point, we're analyzing with more fine detail this relationship of co-occurrence. So if it's co-occurrence, then is it an occurrence of unity or distinctiveness? So the explanation by Seeders and Katsura is, suppose there's a relation of co-occurrence between x and y, then either x and y are really just one thing, which is the case of unity, or they are distinct things. If there were one thing, then the co-occurrence of x and y would really just be the co-occurrence of one thing, x, which makes sense if x and y are the same. But co-occurrence is a binary relation, a relation between two things. It would be absurd to say that this relation holds between a thing and itself. If, on the other hand, x and y were distinct, then it would be possible for each of them to occur separately from the other. And if co-occurrence with y is really the state of x, then when x occurs separate from y, it should be in the state of co-occurrence with y, which is absurd. Yeah, I see where that issue is, because if x and y were the same thing in a relationship of co-occurrence, then you can basically have the relationship of co-occurrence with just one of them, because they're basically the same thing. Or if you say that x and y are distinct, but still come into a relationship of co-occurrence, it said then it would be possible for each of them to occur separately from the other. And if co-occurrence with y is really the state of x, then when x occurs separate from y, it should be in a state of co-occurrence with y, which is absurd. Okay, right. So if they exist simultaneously but are still separate, then you're basically saying when x exists separately, then it also exists with y because of that relationship co-occurrence, which doesn't make sense. So okay, yeah, I got that. So I guess let's keep moving. Verse 6. And in the case of distinctness, if there were co-occurrence, how would desire and the one who desires be established as mutually distinct, on the basis of which there could be co-occurrence of the two? 7. Alternatively, if the distinctiveness of desire and the one who desires is established, what would be the point of this co-occurrence that you suppose between them? 8. Saying that one is not established, distinct from the other, you aim at co-occurrence, yet you posit distinctness for the sake of establishing co-occurrence. So I actually want to stop here. I think there's something really interesting happening in verse 8, which is this sort of problem with the opponent who wants to, let's see. So let me gather my thoughts. Does anyone have anything to say about these last few verses? Okay, well, so I think what I'm trying to get at with number 8 is that for an opponent who wants to establish the conclusion that desire and desire are united by reference to their difference, that doesn't actually work because that difference, sorry, this is like complicated reasoning. I can't like hold it in my head for too long. Okay, I think this is okay. So I think the opponent is trying to say that X and Y are not distinct from each other because they co-occur. But in order to establish that relationship of co-occurrence, you actually have to imply that X and Y are distinct. So in a way, the opponent is trying to say that X and Y are not distinct because they're first distinct. So it's this like way, it's a way in which the opponent is undermining their own reasoning in order to establish the conclusion that Nāgārjuna is pointing out. And I guess the reason why I found this verse interesting is that I feel like I see that kind of faulty reasoning a lot, especially with myself sometimes, where you're trying to establish something, but you do it in a manner that undermines the very thing that you're trying to establish. So in here, we can say that like the means that's used to reach a certain end is contrary to that very end. And perhaps from what we can learn from Nāgārjuna is that when your means are contrary to the end, it's not necessarily that you have to reevaluate your means. Maybe some other means can establish your end, but perhaps reevaluating the end itself. So in this case, instead of finding ways to ground the intrinsic existence of the co-occurrence of desire and desire, maybe you reevaluate the idea of a ultimately real intrinsic desire and desire in the first place to establish. I did all that thinking and pausing when I should have just continued with the commentary that Siddhartha and Katsura already supply. Their explanation for verse 8 is, to say that the two are co-occurrent, one must first establish that they are separate, distinct existence. Having done so, however, one has thereby undermined their co-occurrence. And 9 and 10. If distinctness is not established, co-occurrence is not established. If there is distinctness of the two, in which do you posit co-occurrence? Thus, there is establishing of desire, neither together with the one who desires, nor apart from the one who desires. As with Dharma, so for all Dharmas, or as with desire, so for all Dharmas, there is establishing neither together nor apart. So here we're sort of left in this seemingly paradoxical, indeterminate state where we cannot establish either desire apart from the desirer. So we can't establish a state separate from its possessor, but neither can we establish that the state comes together with the possessor. And then Nāgārjuna at the very end generalizes this to all dharmas, that they're establishing neither togetherness nor apartness. And I guess this is where I'm going with the whole means and ends thing. With this, in this paradoxical and indeterminate situation we could struggle to keep trying to find ways to still establish the conclusion, but perhaps the way to get out of this paradox and to resolve it is to actually reevaluate the very thing we're trying to establish in the first place, which is the ultimate existence of state and possessor. So perhaps a paradox arises only when we assume implicitly or explicitly the intrinsic existence of state and possessor. So perhaps the paradox resolves itself when we reevaluate the end that we're trying to get to. So we're not trying to establish ultimately existing things anymore. Which doesn't mean the paradox resolves into a conclusion that we can grasp onto either, right? It's something totally different. So I'll read the last paragraph with Siddhartha and Katsura gives their commentary. So no coherent account can be given of those features of reality that depend for their occurrence on the occurrence of something else in the way in which desire is thought to depend on the locus in which it occurs. Notice that this does not mean that state and the locus that is its subject are really one. It means instead that wherever we find this relationship of dependence, neither of the relata can be thought of as ultimately real. Cool, so that's it for chapter 6. Does anyone have any concluding comments on that?
I feel like I get it a bit.
Cool. And I think you'll find that your experience and my experience of reading the whole Muli Madhyamaka Karikas is, as you progress with all the different chapters and the different kinds of arguments that repeat, previous arguments will also be clarified because of this underlying similar structure between many of the arguments. So yeah, so in some sense you can say Nāgārjuna is kind of repetitive sometimes, but I think he's merely being exhaustive with his analysis, and later analyses that you might be able to grok at better might help you with previous analyses because of how similar some of these arguments are. Especially with this next chapter, we're going to go into analysis of conditioned. You have a lot of the same kind of arguments coming up, particularly with the 3 times. I think in terms of all the arguments that repeat, I think the argument of the 3 times so far has come up the most.
Unfortunately, I have to leave now.
Sure.
So, but thanks a lot, and I will be there next week again. So, bye, guys.
Yeah, thanks for coming. See ya.
Bye.
Okay, just us 3. All right, let's see. Chapter 7. Okay. Let me get in my notes real quick. Okay, cool. So there's a little asterisk that qualifies the name of this chapter. So apparently, according to the Prasanapada and the Akutapaya by Chandrakirti and is it Akutapaya by Bhavipaka?
Akutobhaya is the auto commentary, or rather, it's regarded generally as the auto commentary, but the fact that there are sort of different recensions of it suggests that it's probably it's probably more of my headcanon is that it's Aryadeva's notes that then just got added to by Aryadeva's students successively. But the Akutobhaya is generally regarded as being concurrently produced with the MMK itself.
Oh, okay. I somehow missed that in the beginning. Okay, cool. Yeah, so according to the Prasanapada and the Akutapaya, it's titled Analysis of the Conditioned. The Buddha Palita and Bhavavika corrects this to analysis of origination, duration, and cessation, which makes sense given the content of the chapter. But I'll let the scholars figure out which one is the right chapter name. Cool. So the bulk of this chapter is an analysis of one aspect of conditioned existence, which is the origination of things. And as we will see, with a thoroughgoing analysis of origination, we'll have a lot of the same resources that we can use to also analyze and undermine the inherent existence of duration and cessation. There's slightly different arguments that might also be used for duration and cessation, but the arguments for any one of them seems to generalize to all the others. Cool. So for the interest of time, I don't think we have to, I don't think we can go verse by verse, but I tried to follow the general structure of the arguments as I was reading, so I'll mostly refer to those, to my notes on that. And Sagar or Gregor, if you want to butt in any point, please do. I will read some verses as they come up if they're important enough. So I will start with the first one. If origination is conditioned, then the 3 characteristics of origination, duration, and cessation apply to it. But if origination is not conditioned, how can it be characteristic of the conditioned? So this is pretty much how most of the chapter goes, is analyzing these three aspects of conditioned existence by means of those same three characteristics of origination, duration, and cessation. So initially, we're analyzing the origination of origination. And let's see. So the first question that comes up is origination a conditioned or unconditioned phenomenon? And if it's conditioned, then this leads to an infinite regress. So if it's conditioned, that means that origination also has an origination. But that leads to an infinite regress, because then because then that asks us, well, that makes us ask, well, is the origination of origination, is that conditioned or unconditioned? And if that's conditioned, then we have an origination of the origination of the origination. So likewise, we never reach an actual conclusive point, and that leads to a problem of infinite regress. And that's so that's the argument in the Akuttabhaya. Chandrakirti has a different argument against the conditioned nature of origination, which is that, according to the text commentary, Chandrakirti thinks the problem is instead that when what is supposed to be a characteristic of dharmas becomes itself another dharma that is among the things to be characterized by the characteristics of origination, and so on. And how can a characteristic characterize itself? Sagar, do you have a sense of this argument? I don't quite grasp that. Chandrakirti's argument here.
So, let me think for a second, because I also was a little bit.
Yeah, so it seems like by saying, so we're trying to characterize a dharma as a conditioned dharma as originating.
The weird thing of this whole chapter is that it's so hard to think of origination, duration, and cessation as objects instead of as events. But this is how the Sarvastivadin ontology works. But I guess it's just very alien to me, because I would say that the origination of a thing is an event. It's not an object at all. It's a events don't exist; they happen. Does it make sense? Like, existence is not the type of verb that events do, is it? Maybe. So I feel like origination isn't the type of thing which would either exist or not exist. It's the type of thing which happens. Of course, then the Sarvastivadin might be like, oh, but in order to happen, doesn't it have to exist? And then they would get us back here. But I don't know. For this whole chapter, I was just a bit lost trying to get into the head of a Sarvastivadin.
Yeah, I totally get that. That definitely is. Especially these are events that like lead into each other necessarily. So that it definitely makes it hard to grasp onto them as these discrete moments, which I guess is how we're analyzing it, because existence is momentary. That's what you just said does make me think a little bit about contemporary object-oriented ontology as like this like one movement in contemporary continental theory. And I don't know a whole lot about it. I read a good amount of it, books about it a couple of years ago, and I have to visit them. But object-oriented ontologists definitely subsume events into objecthood. So events are also considered as objects. So like happenings and events and things like that, ideas, like everything can be considered as an object. And I guess it kind of makes sense to the extent that it's an object of inquiry, or an object of analysis, or an object of perception, or an object of reflection. You know, these are all objects to some extent. Perhaps not substantially tangible objects that are visible to the senses. Perhaps they're objects of the mind and still considerable as objects. I don't know. But yeah, I guess in this case, Chandrakirti's argument, it seems that if we're trying to characterize a dharma as of having originated or in the process of originating, and in order to do that, we appeal to an origination of that origination. The origination of that origination will be part of that object's, that dharma's process of originating. So we can't really describe this process of originating with, I lost myself.
No, I think I know where you were going. You can't, if you treat the origination of this thing as a substantially existent thing, then we have to either go into an infinite regress or treat it as something which somehow is self-originating. But at that point, like, we run into some of the problems that, hold on, I need to go to the section.
Well, I think
that like we just get into stuff about reflex, like refutation about reflexivity, but then also 713 is the verse in question, like that it can't be the originator of itself because that implies that it existed before it existed.
Actually, I think I just thought of a way to explain what I was trying to explain. You can't, the explanation can't be part of the thing you're explaining. And I think that's what part of what Chandrakirti might be referring to when a characteristic can't characterize itself. You can't appeal to the origination of origination to explain origination, because then you're including the explanation in the very thing you're trying to explain. So it doesn't work. I think that's what that means.
I agree. That makes sense. I think so.
Cool. So that's trying to understand origination as a conditioned thing. So what if we understand origination as an unconditioned thing? Well, if that were true, then the rest of the chapter would not be necessary, because if it's unconditioned, it would be a permanent. And so if it's permanent, so if the origination of origination were unconditioned, it would be permanent. But then how would a permanent thing be able to characterize something that's impermanent, right? That doesn't make sense. So for these reasons, origination is neither conditioned nor unconditioned. But it seems like the opponent, our hypothetical interlocutor, is not satisfied with this and will keep insisting on origination as a conditioned thing, and will basically push that through. And so a lot of the subsequent verses are refutations of the various ways in which origination is seen as conditioned. So let's see. Yeah, so one of the next questions that sort of gets asked is, so the characteristics of a conditioned thing, of being originated, of originating, persisting with duration, and ceasing. These three, are they separate or are they together? So I think this is similar. I'm not sure if it's identical, maybe just similar to the identical or distinct question that we might ask. And so yeah, so are the three separate or together? So if they're separate, so if origination, duration, and cessation happen intrinsically separately from each other, that does not make sense, because otherwise they can't perform the function that they're supposed to. And why is that? I wish my notes were a little bit more clear. Well, I think, so the three can't be separated from each other because they can't perform the functions that they have to. We can't really understand origination separate from duration and cessation, because the cessation of origination is what makes a space for duration to be possible. And to say that origination has ceased is also to say that origination has functioned. But if they exist separately from each other, they're not really in a relationship in which they give rise to each other. So we can't really have them separately. We can't have them together at the same time either. And I'm not sure if I quite explained or got it when I with the question about whether or not they're separate. But I think it's easier to understand why they can't be together, because that would be contradictory. You can't have origination, duration, and cessation happening at the same time, simultaneously. That doesn't make sense. If something doesn't come up and go away in the same exact instant. Perhaps someone might say, well, there can be. Some things blip in and out of existence so fast that they're basically simultaneous. But the argument against that could be that that's mostly an inability of getting precise awareness of the relationship of what's happening. Perhaps with the very fine-tuned analysis or instrument of this incredibly fast thing, we can still deconstruct it into the three points of origination, duration, cessation. So nothing in a very precise way, nothing can originate, persist, and cease at the exact same time. Okay, so then the opponent brings up this concept of a primary origination. And so where is that? All right, so verse 4. The origination of origination is only the origination of the primary origination. The primary origination in turn brings about the origination of origination. So it seems like this is one way that the opponent can try to break the infinite regress issue that we discussed earlier when we consider origination as being conditioned and having an origination of origination. So the opponent says that the origination of origination I'm just repeating the verse again. The origination of origination is only the origination of the primary origination. That primary origination in turn brings about the origination of origination. So the idea that the first origination that requires a moment of origination, that secondary origination that gives rise to the primary origination, the way that the opponent is trying to get out of the infinite regress is by saying that the primary origination in which the origination is giving rise to is what allows the origination of origination to exist. So the primary origination, so the secondary origination allows for the primary origination to arise, and that secondary origination comes from that primary origination. So that sounds complicated, but it's basically a circular kind of argument. And that's basically the critique against it.
Right, because that means that this would need to already exist before the thing that brings it into existence exists. It's like with the reflexive thing, where it's like, if it's reflexively originating, like there's one thing to say something has another reflexive property. To say that something reflexively brings itself into existence runs into the same problem as saying that this brings this into existence, which brings that into existence. Although what's funny is, I feel like Nāgārjuna actually kind of seems like he does have to end up accepting some kinds of circular dependence relationships, just not this one maybe, because he thinks that the mind is empty. meaning that the mind is, exists in dependence upon conceptual imputation. But it's also minds that do conceptual imputation. So let's say there's something out in the world that exists in dependence on conceptual imputation, like an arisen thing, because Nāgārjuna thinks all arisen things are empty, and thus, because causality is just a mental imputation. This arisen water bottle, I keep using the water bottle, just like in the classical Sanskrit Indian example of a water jug being like a stock example of an object. I keep doing the same thing.
Pots and tables.
Yeah. This water bottle is empty because it exists in dependence on mental imputation. In that chain of dependence is my mind. My mind is also empty because it exists in terms of mental imputation. So I guess maybe that isn't circular. I feel like there has to be circularity somewhere in here. Maybe it's like my mind exists in dependence on mental imputation, but also itself does that mental imputing. Yes, that's the circularity. But I feel like that's a different kind of circularity, because that's not like causal circularity, that's conceptual dependence circularity, which maybe is acceptable to Nāgārjuna in a way that this kind of circularity is not. Which seems fine, I guess, maybe. I don't know.
I'm not sure what you're referring to is the same as what I'm about to refer to, but there's a sense in which it seems like there's a certain degree of circularity that arises when trying to explain or describe any kind of conventional phenomena. I think you see this in the chapter on motion, where it's very hard, if not impossible, to describe motion or identify the locus of motion without circularly assuming motion there already. And so perhaps this is like okay on a certain level when operating on the conventional level, but it becomes a problem obviously when you're trying to establish things that's ultimately existent, because circularity doesn't really make sense for establishing ultimate existence in that way. Okay, let's see. Yeah, for the interest of time, we're definitely going to have to skip over some of the bulk of the verses, but hopefully we can go through some of the major arguments. I found verses 8 and 9 interesting, because the interlocutor brings up another example of something that operates on itself, similar to the fire example. So the example of self-illuminating light. Before we go into that, I'm very interested in the status of this interlocutor. On the one hand, you can understand the interlocutor as this like hypothetical other person who you're sort of struggling with to convince them of the folly of grounding things ultimately. But there's also an interesting way of understanding the interlocutor as just like the Madhyamika's own sort of devil's advocate. This sort of self-dialectical analysis happening here with the interlocutor. I don't know, it's that sort of foil against which Madhyamika analysis can occur. I don't know if that was saying anything. I just wanted to bring up that interesting point about the status of this interlocutor, this opponent. Oh, actually, a question for you, Sagar. These brackets in which the translators sometimes put what they say opponent versus response, is that actually in the Sanskrit?
No, it's probably in the commentary. It's probably in the Abhaya or in the or in Chandrakirti's commentaries. That's generally the type of thing which would appear in commentary and not in the verse itself, distinguishing who's the opponent and who is the proponent.
I see. It's interesting.
That's part of the point of having a commentary, actually.
Okay. So the original does not actually have that. No. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of points out how you can see this interlocutor either as an actual opponent separate from the analyst, or it could be that the analyst, him or herself, sort of conducting a self-dialectical analysis, where you sort of allow your own self to sort of escape these arguments. I don't know if I'm making sense here, but anyway, so verse 8 and 9, let's read those. Opponent. As a light illuminates both itself and what is other, so origination brings about the origination of both itself and what is other. So now, presumably, interlocutor accepts the argument against the primary origination, creating the origination of origination. So now the interlocutor is like, okay, well, the origination just originates itself, right? Yeah, so the commentary says, the opponent now abandons the idea that there is an origination of origination in addition to the primary origination. In its place, the opponent introduces the hypothesis that just as light illuminates itself as well as other things, so origination originates both itself and the distinct dharma that is undergoing origination. Like the example of fire that supposedly burns itself, the example of the light is another alleged counterexample to the irreflexivity principle, the principle that a thing cannot operate on itself. The ensuing discussion of the hypothesis will be more thorough than a discussion in the chapter in chapter 3 of the example of fire. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, when I first read that, I was like, it does not make sense that why would anyone believe that light illuminates itself?
Well, I really actually buy the intuition here. I mean, I wouldn't say necessarily that I would say it actually applies to light, maybe, but I do think that I would perhaps agree with Shantarakshita in thinking that the anti-reflexivity principle maybe is relevant in these cases, or like in the case of, say, epistemic instruments, like Nāgārjuna discusses in Crushing the Categories, or but like I do kind of buy this lamp, or not necessarily that the analogy works, but I'm not certain that the reflexivity principle, anti-reflexivity principle, really always holds. I feel like maybe it might just be that the examples that are being given are kind of bad. I actually think that the lamp example might originate among Buddhists, even though Nāgārjuna clearly uses it all the time when he's talking to people who seem to be Nayayikas, because the Mahasangika, the Sarvasivadan Abhidharma, in talking about what Mahasangikas believes, says that they believe in awareness being reflexive. That is, that a single Vijnana Dharma both has some contents which are something else, and also has as part of its contents the fact of its own existence, if
that's like a Swasam Vedana or something like that?
Yes, exactly, yeah. The Mahasangikas were the first people to believe in Swasam Vedana, and the Sarvastivada and Abhidharma says that they use this light example. So if that doctrine is very old in Mahasangika, it could be that this light example actually originated among Buddhists first, and then Hindus started using it. But in any case, I feel like the intuition behind this light example is just that, like, when you look at a light, there is light at the place where you're looking. And also, when you look somewhere else where that light has shined, there's light at the place where you're looking. So I don't know if that's silly of me, but I like feel like the intuition behind this analogy makes sense. Similarly, we might think, I don't think that in this case the origination thing makes sense, but like I could imagine, I could understand, or perhaps even feel like there may be good reasons to think, at least conventionally speaking, again, following the Shantarakshita kind of vein, that like mental states involve a kind of self-cognition. I don't know. I feel like Swasam Vedana might be an edge case, though, where like we might have additional reasons to believe in reflexivity, whereas here reflexivity seems less. Reflexivity, in the case of something bringing itself into existence, reflexivity seems less plausible, just because like we never seem to see such a thing.
Right. Isn't Tsongkhapa supposed to be quite against the idea of Swasam Vedana?
Yes, he was very against it.
Do you remember what the argument says? I remember actually reading a couple of exchanges between Evan Thompson and Garfield actually about this particular issue. I can't quite remember the fine details, but Garfield taking the Gelug approach definitely is criticizing this idea of Swasambhedana, the idea that that mind has an awareness of itself in addition to its object.
Yeah, so the I feel like I don't know what Evan Thompson's arguments are, but I feel like the memory argument that Yogacara Buddhists, especially medieval Yogacara Buddhists, make, which is that like the fact that we have knowledge of past mental states can't really be explained unless you either believe the Sarvastivadin thing, that it's possible to cognize things that no longer exist, or you think that there is like actually you are aware of your own awareness at the time when it happened, so that a memory of being aware of your own awareness can form.
I actually think that might be what Evan used.
Okay, so,
yeah,
so
part.
this
And I
argument,
think he may have also drawn from cognitive science somehow to add additional support to the idea that memory involves that memory is possible because in that moment in the moment that's being recollected, you also had a awareness of that event as well, which is just an interesting argument to me.
I think this is a very interesting and fairly compelling argument. There's another argument that the medieval Yogacara Buddhists also make. Hold on. Let me... Okay, yeah, here. So the first argument is this memory argument. And the second argument is kind of, I don't know how compelling it is. I can't think of a refutation to it, but it also just seems weird, which is that when we are aware, we are cognizing something. And when we cognize something, whatever we cognized has the property is cognized. But we also, when we are aware of something, not only seem to be aware of it, but also are aware of the fact that it is cognized. When I see the water bottle, I not only know that there is a water bottle here, but also that this water bottle is being apprehended here. But if that's true, if we're aware of it being cognized, then that would imply that we are aware of the cognition that is happening in virtue of which it is cognized. We couldn't look at something and in the very moment of looking at it know that it is being looked at, unless also in that very moment we knew about looking. So similarly, we can't think something and know in the moment we are thinking it that it is being thought, unless we know that thinking goes on at the time of thinking. Hence the argument being, therefore, the act of thinking must in some sense both apprehend the fact that thinking is going on and whatever thought is being thought about. I feel like this argument is weirder than the memory argument. For some reason, I don't know why, but I also can't think of a refutation to it. I don't know.
And with the Tsongkhapas or maybe Gelug orientation, would that be that mind is purely intentional only?
I have no idea, actually. It might be that it's purely intentional.
I'll have to revisit that. It's interesting.
I have no clue. What Tsongkhapa thinks memory is kind of interesting. Tsongkhapa says that memory is... So Tsongkhapa denies that when you remember seeing something, you actually also remember the conscious act of seeing it. He thinks that memory is simply like just thinking of it again without thinking that you thought it, but with some designator applied to it, past. So like if I think of a chair and then later I remember thinking of a chair, he doesn't think that I'm remembering thinking of a chair. He thinks that I'm just thinking of a chair again, but this time designating it as past chair, and that this is what it means to remember thinking of a chair, which I find to be much less intuitive than the thought that I just am remembering that I thought of a chair. But this is his account of memory. What's kind of weird is I actually think Malcolm agrees with this. I remember bringing this up in a post.
Oh, usually Malcolm does not like Tsongkhapa.
Yeah, I know, but I actually remember Malcolm talking about or like raising this issue of like the memory argument, and Malcolm being like, just read Chandrakirti. Chandrakirti rejects this, and I think actually makes a similar argument to Madhyamaka. And it's just like memory with like this designation of past or whatever. I don't know if that's exactly what he said. I might be misrepresenting him. So actually just take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But like it was kind of interesting because obviously normally he doesn't like Tsongkhapa. Anyway.
Yeah, cool line of discussion.
Bit of a tangent.
Yeah.
I feel like anti-reflexivity. Anyway, I also kind of like the other reason I like the lamp analogy is because, okay, let's say we say the mind is an exception to anti-reflexivity. The mind does have reflexive awareness. Now, since it doesn't cognize objects, the aspect of awareness, which is just cognizing itself, not only does it not cognize objects, it's also not, it doesn't have the dual structure of awareness, which means it can't enter, it by itself cannot be involved into entering, at least from the Yogacara position, into entering into prapancha, what Siddharth and Katsura translate as hypostatization. Because in order to enter into hypostatization, in order to reify anything, there has to be something there that you're reifying, which itself means that from the Yogacara perspective, at least, that the root prapancha is subject-object duality. Not in the sense that it's the first prapancha, not in the sense that it's like the most base level prapancha, because I think you could argue maybe like in some sense the most base level prapancha is ascribing a foundation to things, right? Like it's foundationalism. But I think what it really means is it's the prapancha that if you cut away, you like physically, not physically, but you logically, it's impossible for you to continue doing prapancha because there's nothing to hypostatize. There's nothing to hypostatize if you cut through subject-object duality. And the thing is, there's one sutra, it's an early Buddhist text actually, it's in the Shravaka canons, called the Sutra on Luminosity, where the Buddha says, the mind is luminous, monks, and defilements go out. Defilements, adventitious defilements come in. The mind is luminous, monks, adventitious defilements go out. And he uses this word, luminous. And so the Yogacara move is to connect this idea that subject-object duality is the root prapancha with this notion of luminosity, and then in turn combine that with the notion that the reflexive aspect of your awareness is free from the subject-object prapancha. And as such, then, what the Buddha is talking about there is that there is an aspect of mind which is undefiled. And if you can, and this is why, for example, in the Mahamudra tradition, they say that you just have to step over the line from Sansara and Nirvana are separated by a line, and you have to step over the line into Nirvana. What they're talking about there is stepping into the undefiled experience of mere non-dual awareness, which is already happening all the time. Right. It's just not the only thing that's happening because you're also having a dual structure in your experience. And just getting rid of that. And the reason why the luminosity or the lamp metaphor is nice is because this allows a very direct connection then to the Buddha's declaration that the mind is luminous. So I feel like there's a scriptural reason to like the lamp analogy as well.
That makes sense with the metaphor of illumination and everything. So can we say that subject-object duality is sort of like the, I don't know if I'm using this term right, the transcendental condition of all reification. So it's that which makes reification possible, and without which reification cannot be possible.
Right, yes. I think that is the Yogacara position.
Cool. And I think actually from the John Donne talk that we were talking about that I watched, I think in there he actually makes that connection between what am I saying? that aspect of Swasamvedana that is not caught up in subject-object duality, that's actually, that has an important place in Mahamudra and Dzogchen practice, which makes a lot of sense. It's that, yeah. And I think maybe, I'm not sure if I remember correctly, but maybe I think it's something about that faculty that somehow gets misinterpreted or misoperating into subject-object duality. That's sort of, that the principle of the mind both being, both reflecting something else and reflecting itself, that somehow gets distorted and creates subject-object duality. I'm not sure, but yeah. Anyway, let's keep moving with some of these verses on this topic. So I'll just repeat number 8. As light illuminates both itself and what is other, so origination brings about the origination of both itself and what is other. And Nāgārjuna's reply is, there is no darkness either in the light or where it is placed. What does the light illuminate? Illumination is in fact the destruction of darkness. And the commentary says, to illuminate is to destroy darkness. There is no darkness in the light itself or in the place it occupies. So a light cannot be said to be illuminated. Verse 10, how is darkness destroyed by a light that is originating when originating light does not come into contact with darkness? Yeah, it's Buddha Palita, Bhavavika, and Chandrakirti all explain light and darkness are mutually contradictory qualities. So one cannot occur where the other is. But for one thing to destroy another, the two things must come into contact. And contact requires that the two occur in the same place. Yeah, which sort of undermines the implicit claim in 10 that originating light comes into contact with darkness.
This same argument is made in Vaidalya Prakarana, but there the point is to refute a Nyayaka idea that epistemic instruments can be grounded by themselves. That is, like, perception can both give us, like, tell us about perceived objects and also perceive itself to be a legitimate epistemic instrument.
Weird.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird thought, but there Nāgārjuna makes this same argument about the light and darkness.
Interesting.
But that's where I had seen this before.
Because usually I would think that the efficacy of a instrument is evaluated after the fact of its having operated, and you make this evaluative judgment.
Right. Yes, and then based on that, you evaluate how good the instrument is, but also once you've evaluated the instrument is good, you use it to evaluate new objects. So you end up coming to some kind of contextual balance. But of course, because it's a contextual balance that you came to in kind of this circular fashion, it doesn't have a ground. It's not grounded, which means it lacks foundation, which is, yeah, the Madhyamika approach to pramana.
Yeah. Conventionally efficacious pramana is all we need, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, is there any more for this light metaphor? Well, for the interest of time, I think we can keep moving. I want to point out verse 14 has another 3 times argument applied to origination. So I'll read it. In no way whatsoever is the presently originating, the already originated, or the not yet originated, just as was expounded in chapter 2 about the presently being traversed, the traversed, and the not yet traversed. So basically, origination is not happening in what's already been originated because it's already originated. So origination can't happen where origination already happened. Origination can't happen in what is yet to originate because what is yet to originate is not here. And I guess what can be a little tricky again is this present moment, and present origination is not found. And So it seems like Chandrakirti might say that beyond the having been and yet to be, there's no actually being. Sometimes it's just asserted like that. But the way I try to understand it is that where you look for a present moment, you end up only finding a place where there could have been or there have been. So the present, what you vaguely might refer to the present, is actually the other two things. So you never really get to this middle point where you might ground motion or originating or anything like that. Is there any other way you guys might understand this present aspect, why there can't be present origination or present motion?
I thought of it the same way as you just said.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, I think that the next important, I think, argument is, yeah, so verse 15. As the presently originating does not succeed in active originating, why is it presently originating nonetheless said to depend on an active origination? So here it seems like the interlocutor, the opponent, is trying to say that origination does happen in the present, and it happens when there's the active origination happening. And Buddhapalita's, according to the commentary, Buddhapalita's argument against this is that there's no way to actually distinguish between the present origination and the active origination. So if you can't distinguish the present moment of origination and the active origination, if they're fuzzy and you can't actually distinguish the two, you can't individuate the two, then you can't ground a dependence relationship by saying that the present moment of origination depends on the active origination. Because if they're happening at the same time, you can't distinguish them, so you can't say that one depends on the other. So I guess that could be another way to understand why the present origination doesn't happen. This is I can't remember if this is actually something new with this 3 times argument, or something similar occurs in the chapter on motion. Is there a similar argument about distinguishing, let's say, the present moment of motion and the active motion? I think there was.
I'm not sure if it's exactly the same, but
I wonder if we can retroactively apply that as well. So getting to the closer to the end. Oh, this is actually really nice. So 16. Whatever exists in dependence, that is free of intrinsic nature. Hence, the presently originating is free of intrinsic nature, as is the active origination itself. So yeah, so what the commentary is saying is that implicitly here, the problem that's being raised up is that the interlocutor might suggest that, okay, well, you're undermining origination in all these different ways. You're undermining arising. Then that implies that you're actually undermining dependent origination, dependent arising. Thus, you're contradicting the Buddhist teachings, the heart of the Buddhist teaching, not just any one of his teachings, but the very core of one of his teachings being dependent arising. And the Madhyamaka reversal of that is actually no, because you think origination happens intrinsically, it actually undermines origination, which hence undermines the teaching of dependent origination. It's actually by understanding them as not intrinsically existent that the dependence or origination is free of intrinsic nature that actually makes it possible to understand and make use of dependent origination. So it's actually the imputation of inherent existence or intrinsic nature that actually undermines the Buddhist teaching. So Nāgārjuna is not actually undermining the teachings, it's actually elaborating on how it's possible to make sense of them. And here I just want to read some interesting passages from the commentary. The Madhyamaka holds that the teachings of dependent origination should be understood in two ways. Understood as a conventional truth, it applies to such things as the pot and the cloth, which arise in dependence on causes and conditions. Understood as an ultimate truth, however, it is the teaching that no ultimately real things ever arise. The opponent has grasped only the conventional meaning of dependent origination and has failed to appreciate the deeper truth of emptiness, the truth that all things are free of intrinsic nature. So here, I think it's the first time they're explicitly bringing up the two truths. I slightly disagree with that last sentence, maybe. I feel like if you fail to appreciate the ultimate truth, I feel like you don't really understand the conventional truth. I don't see how it's possible to grasp the conventional meaning of dependent origination, but failing to appreciate the deeper truth of emptiness. I feel like the mutually supportive and mutually implicative nature of ultimate and conventional truth,
Right.
because of that, you can't understand one and not understand the other.
Yeah. Understanding things to be merely conventional seems to be precisely what it means to say that ultimately they are empty of substantiality.
Yeah, exactly.
Seems like that's the same insight.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless you're smuggling in some substantial thing underneath them that you're saying the conventional thing reduces to, but then you're not really understanding everything to be merely conventional. So you're
Right.
not, taking the analysis far enough.
Right. At that point, you're just positing a conventional entity as being the ultimate substratum.
Right.
Or an ultimate existent of some kind. The next verse is kind of funny because this idea of a shadowy future being. So let's see. Okay, verse 17. If some sort of unoriginated entity existed somewhere, then it would be originated. But what is originated when that entity already exists? So I want to read a little bit of the commentary to explain this. For some action to be done to some object, the object must already exist. So for the action of origination to be done to something like a pot, the pot must already exist. The hypothesis under consideration here is that the object has a kind of being. It exists as a as yet unoriginated entity. Although the traditional commentaries do not mention a particular school here, the Sarvastivadins hold such a view. But if the pot has this peculiarly sort of shadowy future being, then it could not be said to undergo origination, for origination is the coming into existence of something that did not exist before. And something that this made me think about is how, in a way, how unrelenting Madhyamaka is with the precision of his logical resources. You can't have these sort of fuzzy ambiguities or these weird grades of being where you sort of exist and not exist and you almost exist in order to sort of sneak around these arguments against intrinsic nature. In this case, it's either existed or did not exist, and that's how you sort of deal with it. I just find that interesting. But at the same time, I think that just sort of applies to ultimate analysis. I can definitely see the necessity, or maybe even, I can see the appeal, but also the necessity of trying to understand conventional phenomena in conventional terms, using more fuzzy logical resources. We just can't really apply them to ultimate analysis, it seems. No, I don't know. Let's see. Okay. Let me skip over a bit to verse 22, because that's where explicitly we start to talk about duration now, which here is also called enduring. Number 22 is basically, again, the 3 times argument. An entity that has already endured is not enduring. An entity that has not yet endured is not enduring. That which is presently enduring is not enduring. And what unoriginated entity is there that is enduring? And then in verse 26, you have another instance of the 3 times argument, this time applied to cessation. Yeah, I guess most of the arguments are the same. I noticed there's some slightly different arguments for enduring and ceasing. Wish my notes are a little bit more precise here. Oh, well, actually, so the peculiar quality of cessation actually does ask for slightly different arguments. So there's the problem of whether or not cessation gives, if cessation ceases itself. I guess that's actually that's like the reflection of the quandary over whether or not origination originates itself. I think that might be identical. So the commentary says, cessation must cease itself, lest it continue on forever. What makes it cease? The cessation of milk cannot be what makes that very cessation cease. But if there is a distinct cessation that makes the cessation cease, we have the start of an infinite regress.
This one actually seems like it can continue to apply even if we think of cessation as an event, right? Because we could say, okay, here's some object, it's going to cease to exist. It's ceasing to exist, that's not an object, it's an event. But events also are subject to cessation. So is the ceasing to exist of that object, that event, does it like make itself cease? Well, no, because the thing that it's making cease is the object, or rather, it is the cessation of that object, it's not the cessation of itself. But if we have something else, then we have an infinite regress. So
Right.
it's just the same as the origination thing.
Sure.
Well, I guess actually that kind of apply. If it is the same as the origination thing, I guess that kind of solves my issue before. Like, I guess you can look at this in terms of events and still have all of these arguments work, just because origination, duration, and cessation can apply to events as well as to objects.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, like a happening, like something that happens originates, persists, and ceases. I mean, if anything, what are objects but events? In some sense. Cool. So we can conclude the last two verses. Since origination, duration, and cessation are not established, there is nothing that is conditioned. And in the absence of the establishment of the conditioned, what unconditioned thing will be established? And the commentary states, the conditioned would have to undergo origination, duration, and cessation. Since none of these three characteristics can be made sense of, we must conclude that the condition does not exist. But according to Nāgārjuna, we should not conclude from this argument that what is ultimately real must be unconditioned. For we could say that something is unconditioned only if we can explain how something could be conditioned. And it has been the gist of this chapter that we cannot do that. And then verse number 34, like an illusion, like a dream, like the city of the Gandharvas, so origination, duration, and cessation are declared to be. And the commentary explains briefly that Gandharvas are a class of mythical beings that supposedly live in the sky. The city of the Gandharvas is a stock example of a mirage or an illusion. I guess a castle in the sky would be like a similar equivalent concept here in English.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is kind of key here to understand the thrust of what's actually going on with the Mulimajamagakarikas. We're not establishing ultimate non-existence. We're establishing the illusory dreamlike existence of conventional phenomena that do not have intrinsic reality to them.
It reminds me of a verse in the 60 verses where Nāgārjuna says, talking about how his theory of emptiness does not refute the 12 links. He says, since the Buddhas have stated that the world is conditioned by ignorance, because ignorance is the first link, why is it not reasonable to assert that this world is a mental construction or is a mere conceptualization? Since it comes to an end when ignorance ceases, why does it not become clear then that it was conjured by ignorance?
Right.
In other words, he's just saying, look, I'm not really saying something different than the Buddha said. You all were making the misunderstanding of thinking that the 12 links are to be primarily understood in a causal sense, where like a causally efficacious moment, like mental event that possesses ignorance, proceeds to cause whatever the next link is. That's not what's happening. Ignorance is the precondition for all of this, by which he means it's all merely the dreams of the ignorantly believing things to be real. It's the mental construction of that. That's what I guess is the kind of the point of that verse. Man, I really wish someone would translate Chandrakirti's commentary on 60 verses again, because I think Don Lopez translated it, but that like they didn't print that many copies of that translation. It was like a particular academic like publishing of it or whatever, and so the like it's really expensive and hard to get, and it was never digitized either. But I would really like to read like Chandrakirti's commentary on that verse, for example.
Maybe you can email him and ask him for a copy.
Maybe I can. Was it Don Lopez? Oh no, it was Joseph Loizo. That's who it was. Okay. Well,
And then do us the heavenly favor of scanning every single page and uploading it onto
that would be
Sci-Hub.
Oh my gosh. Maybe it is already on archive.org. Let's see if someone has scanned it. Nope, it is not.
Cool. Well, it's three, so it's we're at the end. Hopefully we covered most of the substance of the chapter 7. And we didn't get a chance to go through each little part. But of course, anyone who is reading here and anyone who is looking at these videos, they're not looking at this for a verse by verse explanation. But otherwise, still, hopefully it was helpful. Cool. So for next week, let's see, what can we read? I guess we can do another 2 chapters, Object and Agent and What is Prior. It's a little less reading. It's 20 pages. I think we're close to 30 this time. I don't know. But I think that's manageable. What do you guys think?
So we're doing the next 2, 8 and 9?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's good with me.
Cool. Cool. Okay. Well, thanks. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you, Gregor, for being here the whole time. Hope it was helpful for you. And we'll see. At least I know we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you very much, and
Thanks, everyone.
bye.
Next week.
Bye.